right, folks, let's get started. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and I thank you for doing so. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. My guest today is Daniel Chard. Daniel is a historian of American politics. He was on this show a few months ago talking about his book, which is called Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism. This is an awesome book. It's out right now from University of North Carolina Press. I urge everyone who listens to Nostalgia Trap to go check it out. But I wanted to have Daniel back on the show today to talk about this quote-unquote dream of the 90s, and I think you'll find out what we mean by that if you don't already. I mean, a lot of this is the fact that Daniel and I discovered that we both have very similar sort of experiences and backgrounds when it comes to discovering and participating in the left during a very particular cultural and political moment in the 90s. A lot of environmentalism, a lot of veganism, a lot of anarchism, and, you know, we're sort of reflecting on what all that means to us now. So this is sort of like a therapy session for two left guys who sort of found themselves in the university. And, I guess this intersects on a lot of what we've been talking about with Ryan Boyd on Campus Trap, and sort of like thinking about how the left and what it means to be a leftist, how that intersects with our jobs as teachers and as people in the university. So this was a really intense and fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. If you like what we do here on Nostalgia Trap, I urge you to check out our Patreon page. You can do that by clicking on the link in the episode description here. And, you'll find all of our stuff. Our bonus content's been going back for years now. But I would call particular attention to our latest trilogy on Noam Chomsky, my discussion with Justin Rogers Cooper. We did 3 episodes on it. We went deep into Chomsky as a person, as an activist, as an intellectual. Really, really fun stuff, and honestly was a game changer for me in terms of thinking about what it means to be a leftist, and what it means to be a professor and be in the university. So lots of insights there, expanded ideas from this conversation you can find on our Patreon page. So do that if you want. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We appreciate your support and enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Daniel Chard. All right, Daniel Chard, welcome back to Nostalgia Trap. Great to see you.
Likewise. Thank you, David.
I want to call people's attention to the episode that you were on previously. That was a really popular episode, I think, because we talked about subjects that were, I think, near and dear to a lot of people who listen to this show, and that is, I don't know, the left, the right, radical violence, the state, anarchism. And I wanted to talk with you again about the 90s and sort of like the 90s left. But I just want to remind everyone that episode was called The Cult of the Gun. It's episode 326. It's a free episode. Anyone can listen to it. Go check it out because I really enjoyed it. And Justin Rogers Cooper ended up writing a pretty detailed essay about that episode and about your book, which I want to show you that I actually have a real copy of it now, dude.
Nice.
Yeah, I was working on a digital PDF last time we spoke, but your book is called Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism. And I mean, this book could not be more prescient, honestly, right now with the FBI apparently going to war with Donald Trump at his house. And, I don't know where any of that's just happening. So I don't know where any of that is headed, but it's part of it. It's a long history, right? The FBI is a shady, weird organization.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And my mom was just texting me about that this morning, and I was distracted in this other thing I'm writing. So I only saw the headlines, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Weird echoes of all that stuff happening right now.
Well, I mean, the subject that I wanted to talk with you about is kind of a broad one in terms of the dream of the 90s, which does that phrase literally come from like a Portlandia sketch?
Yeah, it does. But when I emailed you, I kind of I show that sketch in a PNW history class that I teach at Western University, kind of to talk about some of the themes of regional history that are there. But I put that we talk about throughout the quarter. But I mentioned it just because I think there's a weird, in our emails we were getting ready to talk about the show, because I think there's we talked about last time how we're still stuck in the 60s with social movements, but I think that's also been filtered through like the 90s, and here in the Pacific Northwest, especially like 2020, you had these weird echoes of like the Battle of Seattle and all the stuff that happened in Eugene, in terms of black bloc anarchists, some property destruction, this kind of politics of like mutual aid and fuck shit up as like and by fuck shit up I mean like property damage, and street, maybe some street fighting as like the path to a revolutionary society. And if you're not from an anarchist subculture or on the left, you might be hearing this and be thinking like, that's crazy, like that's ridiculous, that's how you're going to create change. But if you're in it,
it's a different view. I mean,
but now I'm an old man who sounds like maybe a sellout to other people who might be listening to this. It's kind of like.
So you're not throwing bricks through Starbucks windows anymore?
Yeah. No, I'm definitely not doing that. And I'm not. On one hand, I think I don't want to just like be up here like morally condemning people either, but I also don't want to be like cheering it on as other people are getting arrested,
right?
Lives really fucked up and kind of are being forgotten about, because I think there was something like 1,400 people arrested throughout the country during the 2020 uprisings. And there's some sociologists and that do a project called the Prosecution Project, and they've been tallying it. And then there's a kind of like anarchist network that's like that created a website that's doing support for some of these prisoners, but it's pretty limited. And
it seems like it's funny because I feel like one big flash of this this strand of left politics that you're talking about was present at Occupy Wall Street in 2011. Is that 2011? Where when I was there, because I kind of come from California and had contact with the sort of anarchism that you're describing, I was waiting for like the black bloc to show up at Occupy Wall Street, right? Like I was.
Yeah, that's funny.
And there actually was like I think quite a bit of discussion of like sort of what the tactics were and what if that was going to actually happen, but it was in the atmosphere. It was like it's like a part of the imagination of the left for better or for worse. And I'm with you in the sense of like I don't want to just like I'm not sitting here like condemning or saying one tactic is right or wrong. I think we went through a lot of that in our last episode because we were talking about sort of like how this went down in the 60s and your book, like how like the state built a whole infrastructure to kind of attack this sort of revolutionary activity as terrorism. And I mean the history is long, and the right was doing this kind of stuff and still is, right? I mean it's part of like it's a weird war when you have like movements that are sort of paramilitary movements doing, I don't know, property damage or violence or whatever, and then the state involved in that as well. And it seems like the 90s that was all over the place. I mean, on the right, it was like Oklahoma City and Ruby Ridge and like all that crazy shit. It's like, I don't know. It all scares me. For me, like all of it is just like, ugh, because the state seems like they're always going to win that shit to me.
Yeah. I just read this book, this guy, Tom Wilson, TK Wilson, it's called Killing Strangers. He's at St. Andrews University in Scotland, and it's like this kind of long history of political violence in Western Europe and North America. But I mean, he kind of talks about how like with the creation of the modern state and what Max Weber famously calls the the state establishing legitimate monopoly on violence. Like it's kind of like whether it's leftist guerrillas in the 70s or whether it's anarchist black bloc or ELF, or like there's this new thing, Jane's Revenge, maybe you've heard of, where we could talk about, that's carrying out some little bit of property destruction, targeting these fake like anti-abortion like parenting clinics.
I have seen that. Yeah, I didn't realize there was a name for that though. Jane's Revenge.
Yeah, and it's very anarchist. It's very much like ELF, and then it's also being overblown by people on the right who are like, gather your guns because Jane's Revenge, like Antifa, anarchist terrorists are coming. But like these groups, like really, they have little hope of like really creating any change, and like with in the face of like the modern state being seen as a legitimate authority. So like, I think while on one hand, I'm not here to morally condemn people on the left, and like, it's hard because like, it's like, especially for, well, I'm not morally condemning, like we need to be real about analyzing power here too, so we can hopefully come together past all the sectarianism and the posturing and stuff.
And what exactly are we doing? Like, I don't know.
The right's been building. They have strategies. Yes. They have a long game. They want to create a new constitution, an old convention. That's like part of the long game. But we need to actually like be able to think strategically and not about this.
I agree. It makes me the little things like that though, the Jane's Revenge stuff. I mean, makes me think of like the Berrigan brothers in the 60s who like went and like destroyed draft board records, which actually like legitimately saved the lives of probably a ton of people, because it just there was no internet, so it like destroyed these records of these guys that were going to be drafted. There's little things like that, but in terms of like the long strategy. Maybe that's the dream of the 90s we can talk about, because it's weird. I didn't really, when I was young, I mean, I definitely associated the left and political stuff with like the Pacific Northwest. I mean, I come from Ventura, California.
Yeah.
That culture was definitely surrounding me when I was young. But what's crazy is like, if you read about like the WTO protests, right? The battle in Seattle in 99, it's like, there's all this massive, very loose coalition of like hundreds of different left groups that are like coming together, and I'm like, where the fuck did that go? Like, where is that world? Like, I'm like, what did the internet just destroy that? Because it seems like there was a more robust, diverse, like clear-eyed left in the 90s. Maybe if we went back, it'd be like, no, it wouldn't seem like that. But it just seems like that now, compared to how fractured things are.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about a little bit of your story in that time. Maybe we could share.
Yeah, for sure.
Of being,
what do we actually do?
Yeah, narcissistic. Like, share a little bit of our stories and talk about that timeline, because I think I was just actually writing a review of this new Weather Underground podcast that came out, Mother Country Radicals, and I won't spoil my review.
Cool.
Sympathetic but critical. But anyway, like. But think about timing. Someone like Bernadine Dorn, like it's like she was 20 in 1964. She was going to go to Freedom Summer, but like she was just, there's a way in which we don't make, as Mark said, we make history, but not under the conditions of our choosing. Like I think about how I was born in this particular time and place where like I came of age in the late. I graduated high school in 97, and like there was a militant animal rights movement happening at that time that was really direct action oriented, and I went from that to environmental movement, and then I did a summer class in Vermont at the Institute of Social Ecology. I saw Murray Bookchin talk, and there was people there in summer 99 talking about going to Seattle, and that's kind of where I didn't make it. I couldn't afford to get out there, and I didn't.
Why the Pacific Northwest? It always makes me wonder, like, why exactly is that there? I mean, in my book, I wrote about a coffee house in Seattle, and the Seattle coffee house in the 70s, which was a GI coffee house meant for like, anti-war GIs and to make contact with the anti-war civilian movement. But like Seattle, that coffee house called the Shelter Half lasted way longer than any other coffee house in the United States. It had a robust like sort of like staff that were drawn from the colleges. I think part of it was like the University of Washington had a lot of radicals there, but there's also like part of my one guess I had about why that was is like there's such a like robust like union and like very particular like
Yeah.
working class sort of. I mean, the shutdown that happened in Seattle, what in the 20s is part of that as well, right? There was like
Yeah, there's 1919 is the general
1919,
strike.
right?
Yeah.
There's, in other words, there's like a, I don't know, there's a left history in Seattle specifically, but in the whole Pacific Northwest that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I think briefly, because like this is something I talk about in our class. Like we ask that question, why is this the Pacific Northwest have this history of just like communes and social experimentation and also radicalism on the left, but also like extremism on the right.
That's right.
And I think, let's not forget, like, Northern Idaho has this whole history of white supremacists, and Eastern Washington too, and militias and stuff.
That's right. It's the place to be free.
Yeah. Even, but anyway, I think part of it has to do with it being one of the last areas that was colonized and settled by a lot of people who, some of them were Americans, some of them were immigrants from other places, especially Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Canada. But like people, and then there was also Asian immigration. But like it was a place where people, one, they came here looking for social experimentation and trying new things. It was colonized, really development, really fast in the late 19th century. Yep. It's beautiful and gorgeous here and lots of resources. But then the work people did, fishing, logging, mining, was really hard work. So it was kind of ripe with itinerant laborers, and you had, so the IWW, the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, were really big in the Northwest, and then this other union stuff, as you mentioned. So I think it's a combination. Like there's been this industry and the union movement history, as well as like a lot of countercultural experimentation, progressive. So yeah, like you have this Portlandia scene kind of going back to the progressive era.
I think of Nirvana and all of that. I mean, when I think of the 90s, it's like the Pacific Northwest was the hot spot in every way, culturally, politically, etc. And that's the dream of the 90s too. I mean, it's weird because you asked about like what are the personal experiences. To me, it's like watching. It's weird because there was a cultural element to it of like the cool kids, and I mean the counterculture kids, white dudes with dreadlocks, like those guys were like cool at my school. Like I don't know, it's just not quite the same as it is now. The culture, but it's kind of like crust punk dudes, like all of those people were heading north, like from Ventura. Like they were going up, like when we graduated from high school and everyone was heading up to college. I come from a very like middle class town, and like the middle class kids, these were middle class kids, by the way. They were heading up to, they wanted to go to Santa Cruz, they wanted to go up to Berkeley, and they wanted to go up to Seattle and Portland and those kinds of places. And that was the orientation. You know what's funny is the image in my mind. I'm glad you brought up the animal liberation stuff, the animal rights stuff, because that was so heavy. I mean, I graduated in 96, so we're like almost the same age exactly. And it was like I almost blame Morrissey for some of this. Like you know what I mean? Like the meat is murder and like the vegan crowd. So I want to say two things. Why vegans so big on the left, and why like weed? It was all weed heads. Like everyone was into weed, like dealing weed, smoking weed, and those two elements, along with I guess the dreadlocks, were just pervasive in my town, and I associated those people with and like WTO protests, all the like left stuff. It's funny because all those people now are on my Facebook, and they're all like just like middle class people. It was like youth. I guess youth would be the other ingredient I would throw in.
Well, there's a couple things here, because the weed thing, we're definitely talking about an East Coast, left coast split, because the animal rights movement, I did come to San Francisco in like 2000, and there like went to a vegan like animal rights house, and people were like hitting the bong, hitting the brownies. But the left, the East Coast was like a straight edge scene. But let me come back to that.
Interesting. That's 60s too, dude. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of, if you read like books on the, on the 60s, radicals, as you've read a million of them, there was this sort of like discussion of like the straight edge scene versus like the drug scene. I mean, for me, like at the coffee houses, they were all stoners. but they were like really cognizant of like the fact that weed was a danger to them. And that drugs were a danger to them because they were liability in terms of law enforcement. And, law enforcement totally took them up on that as well. So it was like a real fight of like whether we should have drugs around.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Well, just to back up a little bit, the dream of the 90s and the PNW, yes. And then coming back to the weed and whatever. Yeah, so in timing, that issue of timing, it's like Nirvana's Nevermind and like Pearl Jam's album
10
comes out in like when I was in 8th grade, and I switched from like wearing a Skid Row t-shirt and like kind of cut my mullet back a little bit and got into this grunge, and then that was a gateway into like reading interviews with Kurt Cobain and him talking about like the punk bands that he liked, and he also liked the Beatles. He was totally eclectic, and like which I had liked. So then I was kind of like an alternatine. My high school didn't have as many alternatines, but we figured out, I was in a city called Norwalk, Connecticut, which is in the New York metro area. So it's on the suburban train line, the New Haven line. And there's a spur that goes up to Danbury, Connecticut. And we used to take that spur. It cost $2. Me and a few of my friends. And then Danbury had this kind of like mini alternatine scene and music scene. And there was this coffee shop we all hung out at and loitered at, where I met my first girlfriend, actually. But it was called Seattle Espresso. So,
amazing.
And then, the Battle of Seattle happens. And like what I mentioned on the last episode, when I dropped out of college at Southern Connecticut State University, like we drove out to Eugene. We ended up back on the East Coast, and then I bumped around a lot and went back to Maine. But yeah, so there definitely was that, and I saw echoes of that in 2020. But then it was interesting. Like in the animal rights scene, I actually got introduced to Morrissey and the Smiths, and also to like hardcore and like Earth Crisis and these other bands. Shelter, I liked Shelter more than Earth Crisis, but like through this straight edge scene, and I just kind of didn't really drink or smoke much in my 20s, but then other people I came to the music through the politics, but others had come. So I'd go to those shows and stuff, but there was definitely that counterculture of that militant vegan, and we just go to protests every weekend, like anywhere between Boston and Washington, D.C. We like driving all over the place, and we like, this is going to be a big protest, wink, wink, meaning we knew that some people were going to be like locking down with their arms in like concrete barrels at Macy's to try to get them to stop selling fur. So there was that timing, and that those same lock boxes and stuff are then were being used on the West Coast and the Earth First campaigns, and then are used in Seattle. But then you mentioned why did it go away? There was already this like conversation happening about like summit hopping, like how long can we sustain just going from like Seattle to Quebec City to Philly for the RNC in 2000 was a big one I was at, and the DNC Rage Against the Machine played there during a riot.
I remember this. So when you say summit hopping, that term means what?
It means like going from one big national or international protest to the next to try to shut down the WTO or the world. There was the IMF and World Trade Organization's protest in April 2000, right? That was the next big one right after Seattle. And the police just like, they already know how to like control protests in DC, but it's like people went there like ready for some black bloc action, and it's like, forget about it. The police just, they did a mass, I was actually part of this massive preemptive arrest the day before the big protest. They kettled over 1,000 people, just like arrested people. So
the state crushed it. You can say that part of it is the state crushed it, right? Because there was also, we talked about this last time, it was during the Bush administration, but I think it was renewed during the Obama administration too, like the animal extremism acts that basically put like massive penalties on like property damage associated with animal rights and that kind of stuff. They literally just made laws specifically about this type of activity. And said like these are life sentences and shit like that. And in terms of personal,
and not to justify it, but it wasn't just like they made shit up because like they thought us protesting was like this massive threat to the state, and we were like super effective, and like the whole world was going to become vegan, and the animal industry was going to shut down. There was like direct action happening, and it was pretty minor, and the penalties are totally disproportionate. But that does what you're talking about, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. does come out of this legacy of coming out of the 70s of like this development of preemptive, harsh policing, dealing with various forms of direct action.
I was in terms of summit hopping. I mean, I was at the RNC, the Republican National Convention in 2004, which was
4 years after Philly,
right? Which was in New York City, and it was for they were going to renominate George W. Bush. He like came to basically stand on ground zero, like the smoldering wreckage of 9/11, and say like put me in power again, and or let me remain in power, etc. It was a really like intense political moment. And what I remember, I had just gotten to New York, and I went down Union Square, and I witnessed like the thing that was most memorable to me was the police presence. Like that was the thing that was memorable there, because they showed up in buses, dude. Like bus full. Like I saw these buses show up. I'm like, what are these fucking buses? Like just like being allowed to like pull right into Union Square here. And then it's like a music video, like a Marilyn Manson music video. Like all these like cops come out and they're in full riot gear, and they immediately like pulled out these like orange like rolls of that like rubber gating that's used for like construction spaces, those like temporary fencing, and they started unrolling that around crowds. And basically like trapping people with this rubber, like this giant rubber net. And like people were getting caught that were like women that were like old ladies that were on their way to like the grocery store were getting caught in this. And this is the moment that's pretty famous because they sent all these people, like, I don't know, hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 people to like these warehouses that were on the river in New York, and they kind of like stashed them there. And it's actually very similar to what happened to I think the May Day people in during the Nixon administration. They like put them in like a football stadium or something, and like they had no bathrooms, they had no food. Like girls were menstruating. It was like a fucking like total disaster. And to me, like I'm the type of person who is just wants to stay away from that shit. You know what I mean? Like I'm a pussy when it comes to fucking getting sent to Guantanamo. And that's what they were doing then. And it seems like that has to be part of like, I don't know, tamping down that type of protest activity.
No, I didn't go to that one. I stayed in Maine because I think, but I remember having some friends who went. I had a friend who got arrested, and she went through a lot of what you're talking about.
Right.
It's all kind of coming back to me. But earlier you mentioned like where did this movement go, and 9/11 was a critical moment. I mean, there was a big protest scheduled, another big protest against the IMF or WTO, like scheduled for fall of 2001, or maybe the next January or next spring or something. And the organizers decided to shut it down just because they felt like the mood of the country with all this jingoism and pro-war sentiment, it wasn't conducive to really organizing this.
It was nuts, dude. It was the atmosphere was so nuts after 9/11. I mean, even I forget, I think, how like just like the couple months, like that's when the news scroll started, like on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. That's when they started like a 24-hour breaking news thing. But like immediately after, like in the days after 9/11 or weeks, there was like the anthrax thing was going on. There was the Beltway sniper. You remember the Beltway sniper? Like there was and it all seemed related. And there was there was this heavy atmosphere of like we're going to war or something that just seemed like, I don't know. I think the left was sort of paralyzed as like, what's our place in this? War destroys the left, dude. Like war comes and just fucking destroys it.
It does. And I remember almost getting like my ass kicked, like, because like we actually had some small protests of the invasion of Afghanistan, and people just didn't want to hear it. But then we had another kind of wave of big protests. I mean, some of the biggest international protests in the world to protest the Iraq invasion, right? And then that kind of came and went. That kind of came
was
like
that
in the
just
month
anti-Bush though? Like the part of me is like, was that just like the anti-Bush thing that happens where it's like the liberals were on your side for a moment? Like
I don't know. It might have been that. I mean, I was like really like I was like anti-electoral at that point. I remember I didn't even vote. I didn't even vote. I don't think in 2004. And then in 2000, I remember wheat pasting these posters that was like, but what is it? Bush and Gore, and it was like same shit, different pile, or no matter who wins, we all lose. But like, I totally am critical of that now.
Me too.
But I guess I want to back up and say, like, I think an interesting thing when I am self-reflective about like my anarchism, and I was kind of into anarcho-primitivism a little bit, like anti-civilization, or really like my politics was like not even really imagining that another world was really possible, but that like kind of having this weird wishful thinking that like Y2K or some other like there's going to be some kind of an apocalypse, and
Yes.
through like growing our community gardens and stuff, we would be able to kind of like build something out of that. And I don't think, and I still think that is where some people on the left are at. And,
Yes.
and I think it's kind of, I think that's a dead end. Like, I don't think there's going to be like some deliverance, you know, we might 50 years from now, like there's mini apocalypses happening in all the communities where it usually does, you know,
Yes.
the global South,
Yes.
and, you know, but then other people are going to be like, you know, in gated communities with policing and shit, and, you know, maybe sent to outer space, or maybe there'll be some new technology that allows people to survive climate change. It's like, but I think like a lot of that anarchism was a combination of, for me, like end of the Cold War and like anti-communism, B, like American individualism that I thought was radical, but really has these deep roots. And like, and there was a C, but oh yeah. The other thing is the other like socialist, like Democrat, like socialist groups were like, at least in my perception, totally lame. Because I was all about direct action, and that came out of the culture these groups I was in. But like the International Socialist Organization, it was just these people, all they wanted to do is sell a newspaper, and they're kind of ideologues. And I was an ideologue too, but like I just didn't see them as relevant. So 2006 opened up a new shift, I think. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
I don't know. All of this is really familiar to me as a kind of trajectory that's sort of it mixes up the personal and the political really deeply.
Yeah,
and it trips me out to think about that American individualism thing, because the older I get, the more like stuck I feel in like just being American, and like that's how I was raised, and that's how I see things, and I didn't realize that like how deeply that affects how you look at everything. And that idea of like, for me, like I also got into Nirvana, you know, and I also like that led me to like the Beats and the sort of like 60s counterculture, and the idea of like dropping out and like having a job is just so lame, and like that's just death culture, and like part of it was just like me like not wanting to participate in the society. And that becomes a sort of hope that it's all going to crash anyway. Like it's all, you know what I mean? And then I won't have to like deal with it one way or the other. Like I'm not going to have to deal with my student loans because everything's going to collapse, and we'll all be like living on farms somewhere. Like I definitely participate in that fantasy, and I see it as, and have participated in that fantasy as a product of kind of my social and economic position in a weird way, you know? And like my own kind of cultural orientation of just like, I don't know. We grew up in the 90s when like office work and like jobs were seen as just like, that's just bullshit. I mean, there was a lot of culture about that, and like it was sort of like that was a place where you find your death. I mean, I'm looking up at like the Yippie manifesto that's on my wall, you know? and it says like, we are a people. We are a new nation. We believe in life, and we want to live now. We want to be alive 24 hours a day. 9 to 5 America, that's America with a K, by the way. 9 to 5 America doesn't even live on weekends. America is a death machine. It's run on and for money, whose power determines a society based on war, racism, sexism, and the destruction of the planet. Like, our life energy will overcome all this. Like, to me, like, I found a lot of that language very appealing, you know, like the poetic element of it. But to me now, I'm just kind of like, I don't know. It seems there's a juvenile element to it as well.
A left-wing juvenile disorder, if you will.
Yes.
I'm referring to Lenin there for listeners who don't know, but like, man. I mean, that was all recycled. This is obscure stuff, but like, if anyone ever read Crime Think, which is still around somehow, but that's like an anarchist collective. You know, good writers. At least the one guy from the band Catharsis, which is a hardcore band, who did a lot of the writing, and then some other people kind of riffed on that. It's weird, actually. if you go back, if you look at some of those communiques for this Jane's Revenge group, they have some of this similar kind of purple prose in there. But anyway,
yeah,
you're tracing that back to the 60s. And I think, I mean, we're deeply alienated. It's an alienating late capitalist society we're growing up in, suburbia. I mean, but like, there wasn't an organized kind of left. I mean, what we were making up was like, we're making shit up without really much continuity with like older leftists. And I did have some. I feel like I was lucky. I did at different points and still do have connections with like older leftists, and they've helped keep me grounded. I've also had to learn to like realize that they're people too, and sometimes you got to disagree with them. But
the history wasn't there in the 90s. That's funny. I never really thought about that. But like, it wasn't a like left that was super in touch with what had happened even in the left 30 years prior.
No, I mean,
it might have been helpful, honestly.
And I think there was people around who were maybe like socialists and like older and like fucking jaded because they dealt with like all the ultra left stuff before, and now I find myself in this weird.
Dude, there's no one more jaded than an old
understanding
leftist.
Them now, but no, there's James Gregory, he's a historian at University of Washington, is actually writing a book, I think, on Pacific Northwest radicalism as a region. But cool. he wrote an essay called like the U.S. left radical discontinuity, and he's kind of talking about how we've had in the left. Those are kind of these disjunctures. You have the two big red scares after World War I and World War II, but then there's also kind of a disjuncture even between the 60s left, or even the like kind of rainbow coalition left of the 80s, and then this kind of like internet left that emerges later. There's something to what he's saying there, and when I think back about my own experiences,
I wonder, like, what are the lasting institutions? Because I mean, was it indie media? Is that who was around in the 90s and 2000s that were like, that, like, to me, like, when, like, 2004 is when I like arrived permanently in New York City. And one of the first things I did, I mean, because it was August and I was getting ready to go to grad school, but like August was the convention, and I went to the convention, but there were other things going on, and I went to Hunter College, I remember, was having an event with Naomi Klein, who was a major figure there in the 90s as well. Like, her whole, like, I mean, I know people think of her as like shock doctrine, but the whole no logo thing is sort of forgotten. You know, like,
that was big.
Like all the anti-consumerism, which is the left had just sort of dropped. But either way, indie media was there, and they had newspapers, and like, it feels like in the left's history, there's like newspapers and magazines have always been sort of like where, like, there's been a kind of coalition of leftists getting together, and there's some continuity there, but I'm like,
podcasts.
Yeah. Podcasts. There's another place. Yep. Coffee houses. I guess sure. I'm asking, like, what are the left's organizations? Like, we need left organizations, and what would they be? Because the right has like churches, I mean, I guess the left has churches a little bit, but not as much as the right.
I think maybe more in the civil rights movement, there was a deeper organization in the black churches there. Yeah. Now there's maybe a Unitarian church here or there or something.
Quakers or anti.
Yeah, some Quakers. That's all good stuff. I went to a Unitarian youth group actually a little bit in middle school.
Well, that's the Berrigan brothers too, right? Like, they were like Catholic.
Catholic workers. Yeah, and they're still around. A lot of them are kind of getting old and fading out a little bit. But I mean, that's something I didn't think about. Like, I mean, in some ways, I was like anti-institution. It was just like, you form your collective, you form your affinity group, and like, we're going to transform ourselves, and like, we're expecting other people to do that too somehow. But indie media. It's, now that you mention it, I remember. I mean, there was a main indie media when I was up there. Almost all these towns had indie medias, and then people tried to make like info shops, which is kind of like an echo of these coffee shops.
That's cool.
There's a community center in Portland, Maine. It was called the People's Free Space, kind of a 60s sounding name. And there was a Maine indie media that actually had a newspaper. It was distributed all over the state. Maine we had a cool kind of like anarcho left scene. We even like hung out with, like, we had some elders too, including some people, old Earth Firsters, and some like people in this no-wing militia, Carolyn Chute, who's a novelist from Maine. I mean, that's far out. But anyway, like, but, later, I went back to school in like 2006, partly it's like to kind of like step back from this stuff and study history. And part of it, I want the process what happened. But like, I started thinking about institutions, and we don't have a lot on the left. A lot of them are kind of like NGOs, but one that I had the fortune of working with a little bit was when I moved to Massachusetts, there's something called the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which was founded by Robert Mirapool, the younger son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the Communist Party members, executed in 1953. And like, he was in the New Left too, in the anti-war movement, but he decided to create this fund for kids targeted of activists of various kinds, or radicals who'd been targeted. And that's been going on since 1990. I was on the board for many years. So that's an institution. And like, now it's like we talk about the left. I think we should talk about the specific organizations. Like people, like I one of the things I made a note of is like scholar activists.
Yeah.
Maybe I just have an axe to grind. And I don't know if you consider yourself, David, a scholar activist. I've been told that, and I've been described that by others, and I find it flattering, but I think it's a problematic term. But anyway, I think we should talk about like, how does our research relate to what we're doing?
Well, that's the campus
politically,
trap, right?
And are they related? Yeah. Talk about that.
Sort of like, what are the politics of being a professor, or what? I mean, what is your role as a teacher? I mean, my co-host on the Campus Trap shows we've been doing is Ryan Boyd, and he wrote a piece recently where he was just saying, like, if you're not anti-capitalist and like teaching in an anti-capitalist way, like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? Like there's sort of like, and he put it more eloquently than that, but it was sort of this idea that we need to think hard about like what we're doing as teachers, and the scholarship part of it, the research part of it. I really don't know, dude. Like I think that was part of what sort of bothered me about being in graduate school was sitting in the like dissertation room all the time and looking at all these dissertations that through all the decades just sitting there on the shelf. And I'm like, dude, that just represents so much work done by like some people long ago that just like wrote it, got it approved by their committee, and then stuck it on that shelf. And like no one ever read it or engaged with the ideas. And I'm like, just sort of like, that always scared the shit out of me. Because it was sort of like, what is the academy? I mean, part of me thinks that the academy, I mean, I wouldn't be in it and I wouldn't believe in it if I didn't think this, that it's like the most progressive organization and institution in the United States. And it's been like become this like neoliberal corporate nightmare in the way it operates, but at the same time, it's got people that are actually thinking through ideas. That's part of the podcasting thing for me, honestly, is like why I started this. So like, how do you connect what's this awesome shit? Because like, to me, like, I'm a person, like, I'm not from academic world in terms of my family. Like I'm the first person in my family to like go into like higher education and like learn what the people up there in the ivory tower are up to. And I was really excited by all of it. Like, I was just like, wow, everyone here is so smart. Like, I was blown away by like the brain power and the ideas and all that. But I'm also just like endlessly depressed about how isolated a life it is and how it sort of like puts you apart from the rest of the society, which seems like it's totally doing something else. And there's like all these nerds who sit there in the academy and analyze it. And I understand capitalism. Okay, well, what did that buy me? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's part of it.
Yeah. For sure. Like, the thing I was thinking about this partly when listening to some of those your Campus Trap episodes, and because like one thing I've been dealing, the term scholar activist, I hear that used sometimes in like left academia, and I'm just kind of like, and I think a problem with it is that it promotes this idea that teaching or doing research is in of itself like equivalent to like doing some sort of political organizing, and it's not.
Yep.
Your organizing might inform our teaching and research, and teaching and research, political education and stuff, and research can be an important part of organizing. But like what we like, besides the fact that doing what we do in a college classroom has to be separate for variety, just for professional reasons, like doing just, this is a way I think we deluded ourselves too as activists in the 90s, like just like doing public we thought like doing political education, you know, was itself like organizing. We called it organizing, but it was just
like if people just find out information, they'll know what to do.
Exactly, and that's not how it works.
No.
So, and I think we delude ourselves and we delude others, and it's disempowering to people who like. It makes it seem like the only way to create change is you have to like have a whole, either be like have a Twitter account with a lot of followers, or you need to become a professor, you need to become a writer or NGO professional, and like I don't think that's
no, dude. We just finished
people need to be able to form organizations.
We just finished our long Chomsky and Howard Zinn.
Oh, I gotta check that out.
Trilogies, and you know, one of the things that came out was just sort of like this idea of like the countless small acts of people that like whose names will never be known, you know, and like that to me is like how history moves, and then all these heroes are like nameless heroes. When I think about like a scholar activist in a really nice suit giving a lecture about capitalism, I mean, it has its place, you know, but I also think about Howard Levy, who it was a doctor in the U.S. Army who was one of the first guys to like refuse service in Vietnam, and he was court-martialed, and he became a big figure in the radical left in the 60s and 70s. But I interviewed him at his house, you know, in Brooklyn just a couple years ago, and he's just like this old Brooklyn dude now who's just like talks about the left and like what happened to it. And one of the things that he said was like, he's like, you know, the left to me is useless unless it's like forcing power to make a move. And he was like, we need a left that really figures out ways to trap power and force them to move. And if they're not doing that, they're jerking off. And like that to me was really powerful to hear that. Because, I mean, part of me is like, all of that, it should be clear to all of us now, and it was clear to Noam Chomsky in the 60s, that all of that academic work and scholarship can be absorbed into capitalism, no problem. It doesn't pose any threat to power.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that, but then at the same time, you know, and again, listening to your podcast episode, I think like, that's a difficult thing to explain to people who have never been through any organizing like themselves. Like it's all just theoretical and abstract. Like if you've never actually like gone to meetings with other people and like tried to organize even just like a protest, this is all, even like what is the left, what is organizing, that's all abstract. So that's a hard thing. So it's like, it's hard to teach a 19-year-old in a college classroom, like who like came from being high school with like mass shooting drills and social media bullying to 2 years of lockdown and COVID, and now they're in college. And I'm like, yeah, you know, it's nice to just like everyone do be the good you want to see in the world, but that's not actually going to change anything unless you're part of an organization that has a political strategy, you know, and goal. That just makes you just sound like an asshole. It's totally disempowering. We have a responsibility to like empower people.
That's the danger of being an old leftist and thinking you know everything, and coming in and being like, look, this is not going to work, and this is how it's going to work. It's scary. I mean, I wonder what you think of this idea in terms of like, because I mean, part of me is very sympathetic, and this is why I can't ever like completely toss aside like all the different strategies that people have tried to kind of confront power. But like, I don't know, there's this like idea of like, to me, I don't know if this is a stupid idea or not, but I'm always like thinking about lawyers and like how powerful lawyers are and engaging with the legal system. And like, I don't know, there are right-wing groups that are, you know, sort of like, I regard them as terror groups, honestly. And so it's like, could we use lawyers to bankrupt these people, tie them up in court forever? You know, like this sort of like, in other words, a form of violence that's like legal violence, like really aggressive. The way that I'm thinking of the I've brought this up before, but like the comedian Doug Stanhope has this bit about Scientology and how Scientology operates, and they're just ruthless. They just like, if anyone fucks with them, they just like send lawyers to their house to like just bankrupt them. And it's like, what if the left was aggressive like that? I think part of the black bloc and all that kind of anarchist energy or energy to do property destruction, part of it does come from a sense of like, why can't we do something? You know, why can't we do something to confront these people? And like, it's a free country, I can do this. And there are, I don't know, I guess there are legal ways and extra legal ways of doing that. But I've been thinking a lot about the legal ways of doing it.
Yeah, I mean that's what the right. A lot of their strategy. I mean, because they're never going to get popular support by being honest about some of their main goals. I mean, just
Right.
like they're like, oh shit, we're kind of like on the road to making abortion illegal, and then in Kansas, a bunch of Trump voters are like, actually, we still want to have access to abortion. They have to like use the culture wars and right wing identity politics and misinformation to like do things like trying to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. I mean, that's what some of the elite libertarians, as want to do. And so, yeah, they're all about like messing around with with lawsuits and trying to like stack the federal courts to meet their long-term goals. Like, and it's hard because, as you know, like we're like for democracy and so, but at the same time, like part of the struggle is like to build that, like we need to go into institutions like Democratic Socialists of America, which I'm a member of, or like the Democratic Party, and deal with like cranks, opportunists, just difficult people. Maybe we're difficult people ourselves, and go through all these meetings with all this emotional labor to try to like. So
but it's interesting that you're like engaged with the Democratic Party, because I mean, there's a big part of the left, and I was part of it too. That was like, fuck the Democratic Party. That's all part of the same fucking machine. But I don't. What changed for you? Because I don't feel that way anymore, and I almost feel like scared or embarrassed to even say this on the podcast. That I'm like, oh, like I fuck with Democrats, like that's because that is such a line on the left, and I think it's a weird thing because like on the right, do they have that? Do they're like, no, don't vote, like, don't vote?
Maybe it's on the fringes somewhere, but they've been all about taking over the Republican Party since 1964 with Barry Goldwater was the nominee. I mean, that's like it's like we have to work with what we have to work with, and like I agree. I mean, this hits close to home in terms of my recent stuff here in the area. But I've gone to some local Democrat. Our local Democratic Party is pretty progressive, and here in Whatcom County, I've gone to some meetings, but I'm not. I wouldn't say that I'm like. And I've campaigned for people who've run as Democrats. Some of them who are socialists, and some not. Like I've knocked on doors and stuff. But like,
well, that's part of the DSA strategy, right? I mean, that's what got us AOC and the squad.
Yeah. So I've done some of that, but like, yeah, there's in my chapter, there's been huge rifts over that and other big DSA controversies. But like, I just think it's like what we have to work with, and it's like, and we need institutions. We need to build things where they're at. Like just since the like late 19th, early 20th century, all the states like have made both major political parties like rig the systems with local laws. So like third parties just like have no hope. So it's like what we have to work with, and otherwise, So yeah, I mean, and labor unions are important. Rebuilding that's the other institutions like we have or we can build and are being built. But
it's interesting. It's like from the 90s to today is like from throwing a brick through a Starbucks window to like working at Starbucks and unionizing. Starbucks,
yeah, salting Starbucks. That's so funny.
And it's Seattle too, right? Like
right. Yeah. But I don't know. But part of that is just because like of how much worse the economy has gotten. I mean, I remember like living in Portland, Maine. I lived in a house we called the Dirt House with a couple. It was like a Food Not Bombs house too, and there was like moths flying around the oats and stuff. But I won't get too into that. But like, it was this triple decker apartment. We had like 3 bedrooms. There's all these people on the couch too, which was disgusting. But like I paid in like 2000. I paid less than $200 for my room. And like worked part time and. Just was like really involved in the.
That's the dream of the 90s too, right? Yeah. Like in the Portlandia sketch, what I remember about it is like that it's not so much about politics, but like the dream of the 90s is that you would like work in a coffee house like an hour a day and then just like fucking like live on someone's couch. And like I lived that life for a while, for sure. I was definitely like a couch surfing, kind of like get a job for a little bit, and that would keep you floating along. Dude, now like it's insane. My first rent was $252. That was my first rent, and like that world definitely it's the class element is interesting to me because like I said, like I became aware of the left. Like now when I work I teach at a school that is in like literally located in this massive agricultural region called the Oxnard Plain, which is like one of the biggest agricultural regions in the United States, if not the world. And Ventura County just produces like a huge portion of like the global food supply. And like so I drive through like, 15 miles of these fields before I get to the school. And a lot of my students are like the children of field workers. And when I think of the left now, like in my county, it's like very brown. It's very immigrant driven. It's very much associated with like agricultural work and race. And police brutality, and like, that's where the left is. But like when I was growing up, like I said, my view on it was like through all these like white middle class kids who had dreadlocks and who listened to Morrissey and who wanted to like go up to like Seattle and like fuck shit up. And I'm like, it's so fucking different. And to me, like now, my affinity would totally be with like those agricultural workers and their families in trying to like build a left. Like that's to me where there's more power. I don't know. It's really to me like the counterculture element of it was a big part of it. Like I think I mentioned Wild Planet, which was the like bong store in my town, and like that was like a center of the left. Like losing that store is gone now. Now it's a jewelry store. Yeah. But that store was where I found the left. Like because there was no website to go to, it was like this store that sells like bongs and Jimi Hendrix posters and a whole bunch of other like left-wing stuff. And they always had posters up that were like fuck the police and like all that kind of shit. And it like really made me think of the left as a countercultural thing that I don't think it quite is anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think some of that countercultural stuff is still around. But yeah, I mean, I did some other thing. I mean, Trash American Style was a punk record store with like used Doc Martens and stuff and zines and like DIY bands like just like recorded a cassette tape on their boombox and like you could buy it for $2.
Punk element of the left. This is like the punk DIY left, yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, some of the elder activists like did bring in some class analysis or a lot of class analysis. And my background is a little. My dad is a blue collar worker. My mom is a school teacher, and I was kind of, it was a little more working class. But anyway, like, but yeah, I don't know now. I mean, now it's like I look at stuff from more of a distance. But there is here in the Northwest, like there is this element of people who kind of went from YDSA, Young Democratic Socialists of America, and like organizing for Bernie in 2020. And then it's like we had a moment after the Nevada
that's right
caucuses. We're like, for a week, we're like, oh shit, imagine if we actually have to govern, this euphoric stuff. And then like South Carolina happens, and then the COVID lockdown happens, and it's like, what's going on? And then, but there was like a subset of people who just kind of got into like black bloc style anarchism, mutual aid, big time. And I was involved in a big mutual aid project.
What do you think of mutual aid? I hear a lot of leftists actually that shit on the whole concept of mutual aid, and like and they're like, mutual aid, fuck that shit. And I'm always like, why are you so antagonistic to the idea? Because part of me, I don't know. I guess it depends on what your definition of mutual aid is, and as a strategic thing. But just having lived through, like, we talk about apocalypse. And like, I did imagine this sort of like huge alien apocalypse. I was actually really into the 2012 like Mayan apocalypse prediction for a long time.
I had a member of my family. I'm not going to say which.
So it was a way of not, honestly, on a personal level, it was a way of like not dealing with the future and just being like, I know that it's all going to just like we're going to turn into reptiles in 2012, and like. That's what Terrence McKenna says, and that fringe drug left, or the fringe like hippie weird like Burning Man sort of thing, like that was all there too. I don't know where I'm going with that, but it feels like
some of them are still like anti-vax. That's a whole nother thing.
Totally. Like that world is
in that scene. Yeah. Maybe they're listening and they're like, "Fuck you, Dan." But
I know what I was going to say. Mutual aid. The apocalypse thing. Okay, so the Mayan 2012 apocalypse didn't happen. But guess what did happen? Like the Thomas Fire here in my town, Ventura, Like it's the biggest wildfire. We're having wildfires now that are just going to be like this. They're telling us this is just going to be the future. It's just this place is just eventually going to burn to the ground. And when that happened, the mutual aid. I mean, what's happening in Kentucky, right? Like with Kentucky and the floods. Like you're reading about how like just like the guys that host the podcast Trillbillies. I've been following what they're going through there because their town has just been like flooded out, and like they're like, where are the feds? Like, no one's helping us. Like, we all have to help each other. And, like, that part of it is just, like, being real to me. It's just, like, mutual aid is something we're going to have to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's beautiful. And it can be a really important and powerful way to bring people in who want to be involved in a movement and want to do something. And, like, they're good at carpentry or making food or being a medic or whatever. So it's really powerful and good. But I think sometimes what happens in some of the anarchists, like ideological approach to it sometimes is thinking that like that in itself is just going to create like networks of people like not having to work or something. And that's absorbed into neoliberalism because it's just like privatized services. There was one of so Dean Spade wrote a book on mutual aid, and again, I'm not going to be the people who are just like shitting like an either or thing. Like I'm going to come just shit on it over here.
We're more nuanced here.
Yeah, we're so nuanced, David. Yeah. Oh man. But yeah, but what did
your nuance get you?
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, there's one of the reviews on that was like somebody, I think it was Amber Aaliyah Frost was reviewing it on Jacobin Radio and was like, mutual aid is what we had, is like how working class people survived before the New Deal, so it's like we need to have a state with like either progressive taxation of the rich or like taking appropriating the rich's wealth and redistributing it to meet those needs. And like the state's still going to have problems and humanity's still going to have problems, but like we need to use mutual aid, connecting it to like building political power if you're not doing that too. But so I've seen and I participated in earlier in my life being like, we're doing mutual aid and then we're also kind of supporting or advocating like different kinds of sabotage and shit. And if you're not doing that, and if you're just like doing this reformist stuff with the Democrats, you're just like a reformist who's in the way and fuck you. So I've seen a little bit echoes of that from people who are like 20 and 6 months earlier were campaigning for Bernie, and I have to like be compassionate and empathetic because I can see echoes of myself, even though they don't want to hear that. And they have their own experiences. They're not me.
Compassion and empathy is important, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, and this is such a therapy session, Dan, because it's like, because it a part of being on the left is like, I don't know, there's an element of it that's like, well, I know more than I know what's right, and I know like more than others, and like there's sort of like this feeling of like that you're on the right side of history, and like you can convince yourself of like really stupid shit. I mean, you and I talked about the culture of the internet there that's sort of like so rigid. In terms of I think you had a great zinger. You said like, who needs COINTELPRO when we have left Twitter? Because it's sort of like you're wrong and fuck you because like you said you liked mutual aid, or you said you didn't like mutual aid, and it's like, dude, like we need a clear vision of like where we're headed and how we get there, and it's sort of like there's such deep, I don't know, moral judgment thrown at each other always. The left is so fucking mean to each other.
Yeah, I was just listening to Adrienne Marie Brown on a podcast. She's written about like we're not going to cancel each other. I've read parts of her books, and anyway, but yeah, if we're into things like transformative justice, right? Mm-hmm. Like, why are we tearing each other apart and stuff? So that brings us to like where we're at now as like, in academia or outside of academia. And it's like, we're at a scary moment with climate change and the right being so powerful. There's a climate change bill that just passed. I guess we should be happy about that. Mm-hmm, so, it's got some serious problems, but, and maybe there's gonna be some backlash to like to the Roe v. Wade being overturned and the Supreme Court being so extremist and right wing. And maybe that'll prevent the Republicans who have this fascistic element at their core now from taking Congress, but in 2022. But I think that's kind of what we're looking at. It's like, holding back the march of the right from taking power and kind of instituting, legitimizing the kind of minority rule that they tried to do through January 6th, like holding that back and not destroying each other so that we can try to build something that can make some more substantive change over the long run.
I'm with that vision.
It's really hard to do.
But it falls into that like lesser evil element sort of always, right? Or like we have to like kind of support the Democrats because the right are Nazis. But at the same time, it's like, well, the right are Nazis. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know, like that, like Chomsky having just went through this long thing about like how Chomsky approaches all this like inside outside the academy stuff and everything else. It's like, for him, he doesn't wring his hands too much about it. He doesn't like think too much about it other than to just sort of like, we call him an acid pragmatist, in part because he just sort of like looks at the situation and says, yeah, like lesser evil electoralism, of course, like that's what you do, and you don't like sort of like make it your whole politics. That's part of like one element of a larger sort of strategy. And he also, like, in terms of inside and outside the academy, there's a great interview where he says, I don't write my stuff like aimed at other academics and scholars, and I don't go to academic conferences and talk to other academics. Like he's much more comfortable like sitting in a church, like at a political meeting with like 4 other people, just like chatting about politics and his work with them. He's like, I aim my shit at ordinary people because they're the ones that we should be having this conversation with. And like that's to me a pretty simple like way of approaching this whole inside outside the academy thing. Is you're sort of like, you're working hard on your academic stuff, but you're also sort of like got an eye on the bigger picture. That's the best I can see of it.
Yeah, no, that gives me, I appreciate that. It gives me some really good perspective. And
eyes on the prize, baby.
Yeah, eyes on the prize. I forgot. Yeah.
Have you seen that documentary, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I use it teaching all the time. And I mean, that's really actually like seeing that and how they organize, how the civil rights organized, like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi was so inspiring to me to think about needing to build institutions.
Dude, honestly, it's funny being a history teacher because it's like the documentaries I've shown about specific things. You're right. It's like those are actually, I like them because they're in part educations about how shit works. Like to me, there's one called With Babies and Banners. It's on YouTube. I can send you the link. It's about the Flint sit-down strike of 1936-37 in Flint, Michigan. But it's all like direct action, mutual aid, and it involves the men and the women of the town. And it's basically it's mainly focuses on what the women were doing because none of them were in the factory, but they like played like really integral parts in the whole structure of the movement and why it was successful. But yeah, that one and Eyes on the Prize, dude, such an education in what works because there's like really violent, horrible shit and like terrible, heartbreaking losses in those documentaries. But there's also like just like holy fucking shit, like they got shit together and they created strategies that made big differences in people's lives.
Yeah, I mean they brought down Jim Crow. They brought down Jim Crow. I mean, they didn't end racism as we know, but that's one of the most significant like accomplishments of a social movement. That and like the creation of the New Deal, right?
Yeah,
probably which the other documentary refers to are probably the biggest accomplishments of left social movements, and then and the women's movement too, in terms of a lot of shifting gender roles and stuff.
Yeah,
right. Like those.
That's why we're still looking at the '60s, right? Because we're like, wow. I mean, it's weird because like people think of the '60s as such like we're such downers on the left, man. Or like the '60s were just like fucking just destroyed by the FBI and like. Ultimately, like it all just disintegrated and all the hippies just became stockbrokers in the 80s. And it's just like a total narrative of loss. But sort of like, when I watch Eyes on the Prize, I'm like, that's not a narrative of loss.
Yeah, that's like, no.
There are. The 60s did change things. I mean, the reason why we're in fucking decades of reaction to the 60s is because they did threaten the status quo.
They did, yeah. No, it's a good point. And I think I think coming back to like being a good teacher, another thing is like, I don't know, yeah, on one hand, yeah, there's these institutions out here and we need to like collective strategies, but like you can try to maybe figure out a career where that either lets you do things like being an attorney and try to create this change, or like you can take what you're learning in this history class and have it inform like being in a union, being good writing that you're going to be using for, you know, to try to create a better
world. The internet
like,
fucked all this up. That's going to be my thesis, because the internet like it was supposed to bring us all together. You would think that on the left, the internet was like, dude, this is great. We can like actually organize now. You know, we can actually find group and it seems like the opposite has happened. It's like just destroyed senses of community and solidarity, put people in isolation, turned people into like mean internet warriors where they're just going to like fuck with other people on the internet. And it's sort of like, I don't know, that makes me feel like an old man, but it's also just part of like just being a acid pragmatist and looking at history and looking at what worked in the past. And I'm like, the internet, we kind of got too, I don't know, we got bogged down in internet shit as a structure of our organization when we need to get back to basics. And I know that's like a nostalgia trap. Maybe we do need a 21st century new movement. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, Amber Leah Frost several years ago wrote in Catalyst and then Jacobin a critique of hashtag activism, and like it's such a good review. But yeah, I'm like, you know, I went honestly on Twitter to try to, you know, promote my book, and it's good for some professional networking. I connected with you on there, so I'm glad I made some actual connections that are like meaningful, not just professionally but personally too. I have, cool. And you can be, if you're careful, you can do that. But like, we have to understand, like, that's what this is designed for. It's professional networking, news aggregation, self-promotion. But you have to self-promote. You have to do all this other shit, complaining or like promoting other people.
Make like ridiculous claims.
Yeah, to pretend that you're doing something else, but really it's self-promotion and professional networking. But in terms of and like maybe there's this little bit of like sharing information about an event or an organization that'll trickle down to actual organizing, but it's such more of a powerful tool for the right because it's counterintelligence and disinformation and disillusionment and bullying, and that's
anger and rage. Yep.
Yeah. So we're never. I really do think it's more destructive than positive.
Totally.
Big time.
And I'll go back to the 60s again with Marshall McLuhan. If the medium is the message, you know, the template of social media is a right-wing message to me. You know, it's the form of social media is a right-wing form. And I think it's taken a while for people to notice.
In terms of just like self-promotion or individualism?
Yeah,
is that what you
exactly.
mean?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And everything you just mentioned in terms of promoting a certain kind of view of the world and how other people relate to each other. I don't know. Maybe it's just brought out just a really fucking ugly part of humanity, but it feels like it's tied into this moment one way or the other.
Yeah,
you know?
And it's capital. I mean, it's major corporations figuring out algorithms that are making them money. I mean, so yeah.
Well, come back on the podcast, Daniel. This was really fun speaking with you.
Yeah, it's fun. I love podcast. I started out with zines, so I'm happy to come on your quirky, awesome podcast.
Zines, man, those were the shit. It's funny because I remember one zine I remember that's totally like an anarchist thing. It was about cars and about how cars were just like this tool of genocide, and it was showing like all the animals that got run over by cars every year. Like it was focusing on. But God, like that's the 90s to me. Like shit like that was the 90s.
Yeah, yeah. Just
Fight Club leftism.
Yeah. No, I remember being in like a reclaim the streets kind of protest, and a friend of mine like yelling at somebody in a car who was pissed off they were blocking. They're like, "Stop driving your car!" And I was like,
"Fascist." Cool. Well, thanks, dude. We'll talk to you soon.
Rock on.
Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Daniel Chard, as always, for a super fun conversation. I think I learned a lot about myself from this one. I hope you enjoyed that. Go check out his book. It's called Nixon's War at Home. It's out right now from University of North Carolina Press. And while you're at it, go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. The link is in the episode description. We appreciate your support. We will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.